영상이 시작되기 전에 먼저 등장할 5개의 문장을 보여드릴게요. 빈칸에 들어갈 표현을 유추해보세요. 단어 하나하나를 직역하지 않고 전체 의미에 맞게 의역하고자 노력합니다. 그게 바로 영어식 사고의 출발이에요. 그럼 시작해볼까요?
They did that to fight the high inflation. Sounds like a really tough call. Markets kind of expecting, or at least hoping for rate cuts. What does that mean in plain English? When inflation started picking up speed.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're looking at something called the Jackson Hole Economic Symposium. Now, I know Economic Symposium might sound a bit intense, maybe even dull, but this meeting in Wyoming, where the world's top central bankers get together each year, it actually matters quite a bit to your finances.
It really does. And we're going to break down basically 3 key reasons you should care about what happens there, because these conversations, well, they end up affecting things like your loans and even your job.
Okay, let's jump right in then. Reason number 1, interest rates. The big question, the one everyone seems to be asking, is will the Federal Reserve start lowering borrowing costs soon? Like maybe this September.
That's exactly it. And it's a real balancing act for them right now. You see, they've kept interest rates pretty high. What is it? Between 4.25% and 4.5%. They did that to fight the high inflation we saw after the pandemic.
Right, trying to cool things down.
Exactly. And inflation has come down, but, it's still above the Fed's target, which is 2%. But here's the tricky part. Other things, like new tariffs and changes in immigration policy, seem to be slowing the economy down. And that's starting to affect job growth, too.
So they're caught between wanting lower inflation, but also seeing the economy maybe losing steam. It sounds like a really tough call.
It is, and you've got some Fed officials and definitely the financial markets kind of expecting or at least hoping for rate cuts.
So Fed Chair Jerome Powell's speech there, that's going to be huge.
Absolutely crucial. If he gives a speech and doesn't really hint at those cuts or pushes back on the idea, that could genuinely shock financial markets, cause quite a reaction.
Okay, that makes sense. It connects directly to borrowing money. Now, you mentioned how they're thinking about inflation. That brings us to the second reason this matters, right? The Fed's whole strategy for fighting inflation.
Yes, exactly. This is really interesting stuff, looking at how they approach it. Back in 2020, they brought in this new framework called Flexible Average Inflation Targeting.
Okay, flexible average inflation targeting. What does that mean in plain English?
Well, the basic idea was, if inflation had been running low, below that 2% target for a while, they'd be willing to let it run a bit hot, go above 2% for some time later to sort of average things out.
Okay, kind of balancing it over time.
That was the plan. But then almost right away, the pandemic hit and really tested that policy.
And what happened? How did that flexible approach work out during, all that disruption?
Well, looking back, it's probably fair to say this flexible approach was one factor, maybe not the only one, but a factor that contributed to the Fed waiting a bit longer to raise interest rates when inflation started picking up speed.
So maybe they waited too long because the framework allowed for it.
That's the argument some are making.
Yeah.
And that delay, well, it meant prices really started to climb fast in 2022. Things felt like they were getting out of hand for a bit. So the big takeaway, and what some experts, like economists at Deutsche Bank, think Powell might talk about, is whether that framework needs some tweaking, some changes based on what happened.
Right. Learning from experience. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, finally, the third reason to pay attention. The Fed's independence. What exactly do we mean by independence here, and why is it important?
Simply put, Fed independence means that the president, or Congress for that matter, can't just call up the Fed chair and order them to raise or lower interest rates. The Fed is set up to make those decisions based on economics, not short-term politics.
Okay, so it's designed to keep politics out of day-to-day decisions about interest rates.
Precisely. It's about ensuring economic stability over the long run, rather than, say, lowering rates just before an election to make the economy look good temporarily.
But we know, our sources mention this, that President Trump has openly challenged this idea. He called for lower rates, criticized Fed officials. Some listeners might wonder, why shouldn't the president have more say if the economy's struggling?
That's a really fundamental question. The overwhelming view among economists is that central banks that are independent from political pressure deliver better results. We tend to see more stable economies and lower, more predictable inflation over time. When politicians get directly involved, history shows it often leads to more boom and bust cycles, and ultimately, higher inflation hurts everyone.
So it's about insulating those critical economic decisions from the political fray for long-term health.
Exactly. It's a safeguard, really.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, Jackson Hole seems pretty important after all. What's the key message for our listeners? How does this connect back to them?
It boils down to this. These discussions, even though they sound high level, directly influence the interest rates you pay on your mortgage, your car loan, your credit cards. They affect the health of the job market, and they play a big role in the prices you pay for, well, everything.
So definitely not just talk for economists.
Not at all. It shapes the economic environment we all live in.
All right, something to think about then as you go about your week. Consider that balance, the balance between having economic decisions made independently versus the potential for political influence. How does that balance shape the stability we all rely on, and what could shifts in that balance mean for your own financial future? That's our deep dive for today. Thanks for joining us.
영어와 시사 경제 두 마리 토끼를 한 번에 잡는 알찬 시간 되셨다면 구독과 좋아요를 꾹 눌러주세요. 감사합니다.